Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
What's up, everyone, and welcome to the America's Founding Series, part of the P.A.S. Report podcast. I'm your host, Nick Giordano. I'm glad you could join me, and make sure to subscribe and follow the podcast so you never miss an episode, and share this episode with others so they could learn the stories of the great patriots that helped shape our nation, because we have seemed to have forgotten all about our past. And freedom rarely disappears overnight. It's usually eroded piece by piece, often under this promise of security and fairness and equity. Right now, we are living in a moment where the promise of big government rings louder than perhaps at any time before in our history. And sure, in our past, there was some who preached about the big government apparatus. There was some that talked about the all-powerful state. There were some who even pushed socialist and communist policies. But those people were usually isolated. They were considered part of the fringes. However, today that's all changed. They've become the norm within the Democratic Party. People like Senator Bernie Sanders, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, many others that preach and share their beliefs. These people have become formidable forces in the political system. We just saw last week New Yorkers went out in droves, largest turnout since 1969, and they elected a self-proclaimed member of the Socialist Party, the Democratic Socialist Party of America, to lead the financial capital of the world. And in his victory speech, Mamdani promised, and he did it so with a straight face, that no problem is too big for the government to solve and no issue too small for the government to take up. Now, for those that try to dismiss Mayor-elect Mamdani, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and others, you better wake up, because a change is happening. They offer a seductive promise to entire generations who feel disenfranchised, who believe they've been left behind, and who are largely ignorant because of a failed education system that is more about emotions than actual education. It pushes activism over critical thinking, reason, logic, and it's why so many gravitate toward a promise that dependency is better than freedom. But what happens when government runs every aspect of our life? When the government is no longer the servant of the people, but the master over the people? So today, we're shifting the focus back in time, not to the battlefields of the American Revolution, but to a quiet study in Philadelphia in 1781. The American Revolution is dragging on. The nation is broke. Soldiers haven't seen a paycheck in months. Inflation has absolutely devoured the value of the continental dollar. Money is literally worthless. The dream of independence? Well, it's now teetering on the brink of collapse, not from British muskets, but from internal chaos and economic ruin. And amid this crisis, one man, he was a clergyman who turned into a merchant and a writer. Pelatiah Webster takes to his pen. He doesn't hold a rifle, but his words are going to offer a blueprint that just might save the republic. And I want you to picture him by candlelight, surrounded by stacks of paper. His mind is racing with one profound conviction, that America's survival depends not on a powerful central government that does everything, but on a limited, sound, and legally coherent government that secures liberty and sound economic policy that ultimately leads to prosperity. Webster saw the economic collapse. He knew it stemmed from the Articles of Confederation. Let's face it, Congress was a feckless entity. It was powerless. It had four essential flaws: that the Congress could recommend taxes but not collect them. Congress could pass laws but not enforce them. Congress was unable to expand their power even if it was a national emergency. And Congress didn't have the ability to regulate interstate commerce. This led to the states being refractory and disobedient. And his solution wasn't weakness. It was effective control over the economic foundation of the United States. He wrote that Congress must have the power to coerce and compel the states to the payment of taxes, duties, and contributions. Now, notice the tension. He was warning about the danger of chaos, not just the danger of control. His mission was to establish order, but only enough order to prevent anarchy, to secure commerce, and to allow individual enterprise to flourish. He wasn't advocating for a top-down approach of a big government apparatus, and that tension between limited government and effective government defined his life's work. Webster was born in Connecticut. He was educated at Yale, started life as a minister before the realities of the time drew him into commerce and finally into economics. He didn't just study economic collapse. He lived through it. He understood it. He felt it. He witnessed the heartbreaking sight of soldiers bartering whatever they had, their meager possessions, for bread because the paper money Congress gave them was worthless. He watched as farmers refused to sell goods to the army because they couldn't trust that the government was going to pay them. Now, despite ultimately winning our freedom from a king, our country was being destroyed by its own worthless currency, by commercial chaos, the lack of a coherent economic structure. And this is where the popular cry for more government control emerges. People wanted price caps. They wanted mandates. They wanted Congress to force farmers to sell. Webster, however, recognized this is a deadly threat to the very freedom they were fighting for. He understood, and he saw the demand for centralized economic dictatorship as a poison to the system. Then in 1783, well before the Annapolis Convention, or before even the Constitutional Convention of 1787, Webster's going to publish a groundbreaking work, a dissertation on the political union and the Constitution of the 13 United States of North America. Now, this pamphlet was revolutionary because it was, in effect, a blueprint for the United States. It outlined the idea of a bicameral legislature, an independent judiciary, and a system where the federal government had its own power to tax and execute laws, not just beg for money from the states that would never give it over. But the cornerstone of his entire vision wasn't just structure. It was the sacred link between economics and liberty. See, for Webster, the goal of all this political architecture was simple. The great principal object of government is to protect the property of the citizens and to ensure economic freedom, as this is the only way to cement a society in the principles of liberty. And I want you to think about that. Property is the cement that holds society together, not ideology, not government programs, but the right of every citizen to earn, to own, and to keep the fruits of their own labor and not send it off and be wasted away in a government bureaucracy. For Webster, capitalism wasn't greed the way it's defined today. Capitalism was freedom itself. It was the vehicle, the engine, and the right of economic self-determination was the ultimate safeguard against government power and tyranny. And this idea traveled. Okay, his pamphlets were widely read. They were circulated throughout the colonies. They were studied by the great thinkers like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, and they laid out the core principles that would be debated and enshrined in the Constitution. This was a man who saw that the surest path to tyranny begins with the promise of guaranteed security, including economic security, a security that is solely based on an illusion. It's not real. And I'll explain that when we get back from this quick break. So everyone, hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the America's Founding series. Now, if you're enjoying the stories of the forgotten patriots who helped build this nation, I encourage and appreciate you sharing this episode with others so that they too get to learn about our history, our real history, one that examines the totality of our founding and that we could learn from in today's day and age, one that so many Americans have forgotten, and unique individuals that played roles in the birth of America, but they've largely been forgotten by history. And that brings me back to Webster. You know, the American Revolution is over, but the economic collapse has only deepened. After all the calls for massive government intervention, after the calls were intensifying, the war created an enormous amount of debt, and the economy was in shambles. This is where Webster took on leftist economic theory. He understood that this theory never works. In states like Rhode Island, you had these schemes for printing endless streams of paper money to forgive debts, to buy temporary prosperity. That was passed into law over in Rhode Island. And these were the 18th century versions of free money and endless programs. Some that are calling for these same things today, that debt doesn't really matter, that we could just ignore the $38 trillion of our debt, the $1 trillion a year that we're spending in interest, that it's all meaningless. It means nothing. We could just print out more money and give more money to everyone. See, Webster at the time, he stood virtually alone. He warned that such plans are going to inevitably rob the people to pay the people. He was mocked, he was ridiculed, he was denounced by those who promised an easy, painless path to wealth through government decree. How do you think that's going to work out? See, Webster refused to waver. He understood a timeless, brutal truth. Government doesn't create wealth. Government can only take wealth and redistribute it to those who don't put in. Ultimately, what government does is destroy wealth. And his warnings weren't just about economics. They were about human nature. We've seen this time and time again. We've seen this story play out on the world stage in a multitude of other countries, most recently Venezuela, where you had the wealthy elite. Well, once Chavez took over, the wealthy elite stayed wealthy. Those that were tied to the Chavez regime only got richer. Those that were opposed had the means to flee that country. You had the poor. And what happened to them? Well, they remained poor. What did they do over in Venezuela? Well, they just made the middle class poor. He understood, Webster understood, that power will always seek to expand. And once we learn that we could vote ourselves into government dependency, our commitment to real liberty fades away. We trade self-reliance for this dependence, which ultimately is going to leave us poorer. Ultimately, it leads to a lack of purpose in life. And unfortunately, what so many don't see is that when we have this dependency, you don't have freedom. You're nothing more than a slave to the state. So that moment in 1780s Rhode Island is the same mindset that's fueling modern socialism today. It's the belief that government is a mystical wealth machine, that it could guarantee income, fund endless amounts of programs, provide endless amounts of subsidies, give free housing, provide for all the other necessities in life. And it's all going to be done and paid for by someone else's labor. It's the same old temptation that we see time and time again, to accept security at the cost of surrendering freedom. Webster understood that every new dependency is a brick removed from the foundation of liberty and this great country. So every time you ask the government to do what you should and could do for yourself, you're diminishing your own citizenship. You're diminishing the United States of America, and instead you're empowering your masters, the government. See, the system of limited power, of checks, balances, the enumerated powers laid out in our Constitution, it was designed to make it hard for the government to do exactly what leaders like Mamdani promised to do. Webster knew that. He warned about that. You're talking over 240 years ago. Webster would die in 1795. Unfortunately, even then, his name was already fading from public memory. It was overshadowed by the famous signers and the presidents he helped create. He never sought fame. He sought wisdom. Wisdom that would be preserved through a stable, free republic. And his true legacy isn't a statue. It's the Constitution itself and the free market foundation that allowed America to thrive, to become the economic engine of the world. It was a foundation that put its faith in the individual producer, not bureaucratic power. And his warning is the one we desperately need to hear today, because the crisis facing our cities, our states, and our nation as a whole, it's not primarily economic. It's more moral than anything else. We've forgotten the lessons of men like Webster, who understood that freedom and responsibility are two sides of the same coin. The moment we ask the government to take over our responsibilities, you are surrendering. You're surrendering your freedom to government. And he left us with a final chilling statement that echoes across the centuries. It directly speaks to the danger of the limitless power promised by today's socialist movements, where Webster was clear. The ultimate danger is letting power go undefined. And he told the nation that the power given to the central authority must be strictly defined, or the liberties of the people are in jeopardy. When we trade the hard work of self-reliance for the comfort of dependency, when we allow government to promise security at all costs, we betray the very ideals that built this nation. Webster saw it coming. He saw it coming during the chaos of the revolution, and his warning was simple. His warning was timeless, and it was profound. The surest path to tyranny begins with good intentions. Many of the people that preach socialism, some are nefarious, some may even be evil. But there's a lot of people that have good intentions. They have a heart. They want to take care of others. But the belief that the government must take care of everyone, the belief that we are not capable of taking care of ourselves, and the belief that the government can or should do everything is fundamentally flawed. And it will only lead to the destruction of the United States. Now, if you enjoyed this episode of the America's Founding Series, help the podcast grow by sharing it with others. Take 30 seconds, write a good review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and give the P.A.S. report a 5-star rating. I want to thank you for joining me, and I'll be back next week with more great episodes of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at PASreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.